Chapter 3. Rules, Rules, Rules. Usually I enjoy a nice morning nap, but there was so much going on that morning. I didn't have time to settle in for a doze until the strange students left for recess. But my nap didn't last long because when the students returned, I heard Mrs. Brisbane talking and she sounded worried. Harry didn't come back, she said. Did anyone see him on the playground? Sure, Simon said. We shot some hoops. What happened to him, she asked. Simon shrugged. I don't know. Mrs. Brisbane frowned. I may have to send someone to look for him. I'll find him, said Holly, waving her hand. Send me. Just then the door opened and Mrs. Wright, the physical education teacher, entered, pulling Harry along with her. Mrs. Brisbane, I believe Harry is your student, she said. I found him on the playground loitering. Loitering? That was a new word to me. I wish I had a dictionary in my cage. Then Mrs. Wright added, when the bell rings, students should not dawdle. Dawdle? That was a funny word too. I thought his teacher solved his problem last year. Mrs. Wright said, I noticed the silver whistle around her neck and crossed my paws that she wouldn't blow it. But I see she didn't. Harry, why were you late? Mrs. Brisbane asked. The boy, did you hear the bell? Harry nodded. Did you see the other students lining up to come inside? She continued. Harry nodded again. Yes, I was about to get in line when I noticed this cool anthill near my foot. I almost stepped on it. It was the biggest one I ever saw. So you lost track of time? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Yes, Harry said. Mrs. Wright shook her head, dawdling. Very well, take your seat. Mrs. Brisbane told Harry, next time, get right in line. We do have rules, Mrs. Brisbane, Mrs. Wright said. I hope your students obey them. Mrs. Brisbane waited for Mrs. Wright to leave. Then she said, speaking of rules, I think it's time to go over the rules of this classroom. None too soon, I thought. There was nothing too surprising about the rules Mrs. Brisbane had printed on the board earlier that morning. Number 1, follow directions as soon as they are given. Number 2, raise your hand and wait to be called on before speaking. Number 3, stay in your seat while the teacher is teaching. Number 4, keep your hands, legs, and other objects to yourself. Number 5, walk inside the school and use your inside voice. Number 6, treat people the way you'd like to be treated. As I read the rules, I wonder how good I was at following them. I try to follow the teacher's directions, but what can I do if no one gives me directions? For example, what if no one tells me to bring a summer box to school? Still, those rules got me to thinking. The rule about raising hands made me miss Raise Your Hand Heidi, who sometimes forgot the rules last year, but I like her anyway. I can't stay in my seat because I don't actually have a seat, but I always try to stay in my cage while the teacher is teaching. I try to keep my paws to myself, and I hope that dogs, cats, and other large creatures will do the same. I also try to remember to walk inside the school, but I have to admit, sometimes I roll in my hamster ball. I always use my inside voice because even when I shout, it's not very loud. And I treat people the way I'd like to be treated. At least I mean to. Then Mrs. Brisbane talked about the consequences of breaking the rules, which made my whiskers wiggle. A warning was bad enough, and so was a timeout. But a note home, eek! I thought that would be terrible until I realized that my home actually was room 26. Next came a phone call home, but I don't have a phone. And finally, a student who broke the rules again would be sent to the principal's office. I like Principal Morals a lot, but I think I'd like to have to go to his office and tell him I'd broken a rule. He'd be unsqueakably disappointed in me. I was imagining myself sitting in the principal's office after breaking one of the rules when I suddenly heard Mrs. Brisbane say, "There is another rule in room 26. All students must treat Humphrey and Og with the greatest respect." My ears perked up. "Did you hear that, Og?" I squeaked. "She's talking about us." Boing, boing. Og splashed around in his tank, which made the strange children laugh. Mrs. Brisbane explained that the students would get to take turns bringing me home for the weekend, but first they'd have to learn to take care of me. And while Og stayed in the classroom on weekends, because he didn't need to be fed as often as I did, they would learn to take care of him as well. Then the teacher gathered the new group around my cage and put on some gloves so she could show them how to clean my cage. "Who wants to hold Humphrey?" she asked. Not surprisingly, lots of the new students volunteered. Mrs. Brisbane slowly and gently picked me up. "Never poke your fingers in the cage," she told the students. "Give Humphrey time to get used to you." "Will he bite?" Phoebe asked nervously. "No way," I squeaked. "Humphrey hasn't bitten anyone yet, but if someone poked a finger in his face, I wouldn't blame him," Mrs. Brisbane said. "When I had a hamster, he bit my finger," Joey said, "but my mom said it was because he thought it was a carrot." Mrs. Brisbane nodded. "And if you don't wash your hands before handling a hamster, he might smell the food you've eaten and think you're something to eat too." I don't like to disagree with the teacher, but first of all, many humans have hands that don't smell like anything I'd want to eat, and I'm smart enough to tell the difference between a carrot and a finger. "Let's see. Why don't you take him, Kelsey?" she said. Kelsey looked surprised. I'm sure I did too. Kelsey looked like a nice girl, but it did seem as if she could be more careful. "Hold him in your hand like this." Mrs. Brisbane transferred to Kelsey's outstretched hand. "Make him feel very safe. Cup your other hand over his head like a little roof. I think he likes that." I do like that, as a matter of fact. Kelsey was so excited to be holding me. Her hand actually shook a little. I suddenly remembered about her broken arm and her broken leg, and I hoped I wouldn't end up being a broken hamster. "Don't worry, Humphrey. I'll be careful with you," she whispered. I relaxed. So did she. The shaking stopped. "Can I pet him?" Simon asked. "Gently," Mrs. Brisbane told him. He stroked my back with his fingers. I felt unsqueakably nice. Then Mrs. Brisbane got busy cleaning my cage. She took everything out, even my water bottle, and put it in a big bucket of soapy water. Luckily, my mirror is firmly attached to my cage, and it stayed, as well as my notebook hiding behind it. Next, she took a brush and brushed everything clean. After that, she took the soft, papery bedding out of my cage. "What's that?" Holly asked, pointing to a corner. "That's Humphrey's bathroom area," Mrs. Brisbane replied. "Those are his droppings. His poop?" Thomas' eyes opened wide, surprised, with Mrs. Brisbane nodded. "Ew, poo," Thomas said. Somebody giggled. Then all of the kids started chanting, "Ew, poo, ew, poo," in a very rude way. Mrs. Brisbane shushed them. "Come on, it's perfectly natural." "Perfectly natural," I repeated. "Besides, where else am I supposed to go?" "May I hold Humphrey?" Rosie asked. "I already know how to hold a guinea pig." Mrs. Brisbane carefully moved me from Kelsey's palm to Rosie's. Her hand didn't shake one bit. Next, the teacher scrubbed the bottom and sides of the cage until they were unsqueakably clean. She let helpful Holly and just Joey put new bedding in my cage, while Phoebe filled my water bottle and Paul F. put fresh Nutri-Nibbles in my feeder. Yum. Paul G. put my wheel back in and made sure it was spinning properly, while Harry and Thomas put everything else back in place. "It looks and smells a lot better now, Humphrey," Mrs. Brisbane said as she gently carried me from Rosie's hand back to the cage. "Check it out." I hopped on the shiny clean wheel and gave it all I had. "Look at Humphrey go," Thomas T. True cried out. "He must be going 1,000,000 miles an hour." He couldn't be going 1,000,000 miles an hour. He'd break the sound barrier at 768 miles. "And I don't hear a sonic boom," Small Paul said. I was impressed, but I have to admit, I felt as if I was going 1,000,000 miles an hour. "I guess Thomas was just exaggerating a little," Mrs. Brisbane said. "Thomas exaggerates a lot," Small Paul said. "Now, students, no bickering," Mrs. Brisbane told them. "Let's go back to our places." I hopped off my wheel and settled down in the lovely fresh bedding. Phoebe raised her hand and Mrs. Brisbane called on her. "Did you say we'll all get to take Humphrey home?" "At one time or another, yes," was the answer. Phoebe's face lit up. "If you don't get a turn right away, don't worry," the teacher continued. "You'll get him eventually, as long as your parents sign a permission form. After all, families don't always have time for hamsters on the weekend." Phoebe's smile faded away, but I think I was the only one who noticed. I was the only one smiling when Mrs. Brisbane asked the students who'd like to take me home, and every single hand went up. Maybe these new humans weren't quite as strange as I thought. Later, Mrs. Brisbane rearranged the seating in the classroom. First, she had everyone take their belongings to the side of the room. Then she told each student where to sit. There were a few groans, but mostly the kids settled down without complaint, until Mrs. Brisbane went back to teaching and made some notes on the board. Suddenly, a hand began waving. "Teacher!" Mrs. Brisbane looked up. "Please call me Mrs. Brisbane," she said. "What is it, Kelsey?" "I can't see with him there." She pointed to tall Paul, who was seated directly in front of her. I couldn't imagine it would be hard to see with Paul G blocking her view. "By mistake," Mrs. Brisbane said. "I must have gotten the Pauls mixed up. Paul Green, could you switch places with Paul Fletcher?" "Okay." Tall Paul gathered his belongings and moved toward the side of the room. Small Paul picked up his notebook and backpack and moved toward the front of the room. He wouldn't block anyone's view. Somewhere in the middle, they almost walked right into each other. "Watch out," I squeaked. Everybody laughed except the two Pauls. They carefully avoided walking into each other, and I noticed that they also avoided looking at each other. "Now can you see, Kelsey?" Mrs. Brisbane asked. "I can see fine," Kelsey answered. Mrs. Brisbane continued with the lessons, but I couldn't concentrate. I was watching the two Pauls staring down at their desk. I was glad when the school bell rang at the end of the day, and only Mrs. Brisbane, Og, and I were left in the room. Whew! It had been a tiring day. Like most hamsters, I sleep more during the day than at night, but with so much going on, I hadn't got much napping done. But there was no time to sleep now. I needed time to myself to try and figure things out. I was deep in thought when I heard a familiar, friendly voice. "I survived," the voice said. "Congratulations," Mrs. Brisbane replied. I scampered up to a tree branch near the top of my cage as one of my favorite humans, Miss Mac, entered the room. Miss Mac was beautiful. Miss Mac was sweet. Miss Mac was amazing. If it hadn't been for Miss Mac, I would probably still be living a boring old pet-orama, hoping that someone would give me a real home. Miss Mac found me there and brought me to room 26. Then she went to Brazil for a while, and I had to learn to live with Mrs. Brisbane. I wasn't too sure about her at first, but she turned out to be a great teacher. Now Mrs. Mac was back, but where had she been all day? She sank into a chair next to Mrs. Brisbane's desk. "I have a lot to learn," she said. "You'll be fine," Mrs. Brisbane assured her, "but first grade isn't easy." So that's where Mrs. Mack was. She was teaching first grade at Longfellow School. It's exciting, but there was so much to teach them. Mrs. Mack continued, I wish I had Humphrey and Og to help. She glanced over our way and waved. Hi, guys, she said. Hi, Mrs. Mack. You'll be great at first grade. Mark my words. I squeaked in encouragement while Og splashed loudly in his tank. How did your day go? Mrs. Mack asked Mrs. Brisbane. I think it will be a good year. Mrs. Brisbane said, Want to grab a cup of coffee? Would I? Mrs. Mack answered. While Mrs. Brisbane gathered up her things, Mrs. Mack came over to see Og and me. She leaned down close to my cage, and I saw her big, happy smile, her sparkling eyes. She smelled of apples. Maybe I can borrow you once in a while, she whispered. I hope so, I whispered back. But unfortunately, I know all she heard was a very soft squeak. Then Og and I were alone, left to think over the strange happenings of the first day of school. Thomas does exaggerate, I said to my neighbor. I think that fish story was a tall tale. Boing, he answered. Phoebe is very forgetful, but Holly is very, very, very helpful, I added. Boing, he agreed again. I wonder why Harry can't hurry up, I said after a little more thinking. Boing, boing, my friend replied. But I don't have time to worry about these strange students, I continued, because I'm busy worrying about what happened to my real friends from room 26, the ones from last year. I was silent for a few seconds, and then I squeaked what was really on my mind. Am I ever going to see them again? Humphrey's rules of school. Treat hamsters the way you'd like to be treated, which includes telling them where their friends have gone.